Well, welcome. This is session D1, if I copied the information from the program correctly onto my sheet of paper. This is a panel discussion entitled Common Grace, Community, and Culture. My name is Jordan Baller. I'm the director of the conference, but also a senior research fellow at the Acton Institute. The Acton Institute is a sponsor of this session, and it's related to one of the larger projects that the Acton Institute's been involved in, the Abraham Kuiper Collected Works in Public Theology. I brought some visual aids. So a number of years ago, we embarked on this project to translate, and actually Common Grace was the original part of Abraham Kuiper's corpus that we were focused on translating, and then it organically evolved into a 12-volume series. One of the early pieces we did was called Wisdom and Wonder. These are 10 chapters out of Kuiper's larger 3-volume work on Common Grace that we published. Vince Baycoat, who's one of our panelists I'll introduce in a moment, contributed an introduction to that. We are 2/3 of the way through the large trilogy, and just at about 7 out of the 12 projected volumes have appeared. So these are the 2 volumes that have appeared, published by Lexham Press. They're available at the Acton Institute table out there for purchase. Common Grace Volume 1, and the single largest volume of the 12-volume series, Volume 2. So that's what those are. There's a lot there. Part of the impetus was, there's been a lot of discussion about Common Grace in the last 100+ years. Not always a return to the sources and what Kuiper himself said about it. So we figured we should have a kind of a new baseline for discussions about Common Grace in the Kuiperian tradition, and that would require returning to these sources. To help us navigate not just these pages, but the ideas and the intervening tradition and the application today, we've got an expert and all-star panel today. In the middle is the aforementioned Vincent Baycoat. He's Associate Professor of Theology and Director of the Center for Applied Christian Ethics at Wheaton College. He's the author of a wide variety of articles and chapters and books, including The Political Disciple, A Theology of Public Life, and The Spirit in Public Theology, Appropriating the Legacy of Abraham Kuiper. He is also contributing an introduction to the forthcoming final volume of Common Grace, Volume 3. At the far end, stage right, is J. Darrell Charles. Among other things, an affiliate scholar with the Acton Institute. Perhaps more importantly, at least existentially for me, he's a co-editor of the Common Grace volumes now, so he's been doing a lot of the heavy lifting, especially on volumes 2 and 3. He's the author and editor of numerous books, including Natural Law and Religious Freedom, with David Corey, The Just War Tradition and Introduction, with David Capes, Thriving in Babylon, Retrieving the Natural Law, A Return to Moral First Things, and most recently, he co-authored America's Wars and the Just War Tradition, A History of U.S. Conflicts. And I should also mention he's got a forthcoming work with the Acton Institute, Wisdom's Work, Essays on Ethics, Vocation, and Cultural Engagement. And finally, Jessica Jastrow. She's a postdoctoral research fellow at the Theological University of Compen and visiting scholar in Reformed Ethics at Redeemer University College. Her PhD is in Christian Ethics from Fuller Seminary. She's got an MDiv from Calvin Theological Seminary and a BA from Calvin College, so she's an alumna of these institutions, these host institutions. Her research interests focus on the ethics of Herman Bavinck, particularly as it relates to social and political life, and she's an editor of the Bavinck's Reformed Ethics, which are also forthcoming, and we're very excited about that as well. So you couldn't think of a better panel to engage these questions of the doctrines of common grace, its relationship to the formations of community and human social life, and implications for culture. I'm going to open with a question for the panelists, and then I've got a few more questions. Then we'll have some time for them to discuss amongst themselves a little bit, and then the final part of our time, the 90 minutes, which I've already spent some of, will be for Q&A with the audience. So there will be some time for discussion more broadly. My first question, we can just start with Jess. Put her on the spot, but we can move down the line. As a kind of a prompt, is what's your working definition of common grace? And why is it important? Why is it important?
Wonderful. great question. I imagine it's a question many of us could answer in this room. But one of the things that, at least for me, makes me feel a little bit better as I think about this question, which is indeed a big question. Kuiper had, of course, a lot to say about it, is that Fapeten Hor, when he reflected on common grace, he had this wonderful little line, and he said something like, I've studied for many years, many decades, and I'm quite sure that there is something that's called common grace, but I'm not quite sure what it is. And that makes me feel a little bit better because, as we fumble about trying to define it, I think it's nice to hear from those who have gone before us and have thought well about these things, that they too are in some bit of muddled confusion, but are certain that there's something. And like him, I am certain that common grace is something. And when I think about it, first and foremost, I think it's important to note that common grace is a post-lapsarian grace. So it's a grace not originally instated by God, but as a response to the fall. And it's one of two graces that have been differentiated. It is not saving grace, it's not salvific grace, but it is a common, preserving, sustaining grace. And when I think of definitions, I immediately go to the 1924 Synod, which it was in Kalamazoo. I imagine, again, many of us are familiar with it. But it gave us, I think, a very helpful three-part definition. And of course, that definition goes, it says first, common grace is the bestowal of natural gifts. The rain falls on the believer and the unbeliever alike. Second, common grace restrains the evil in the world. And Kuiper has these wonderful lines in these volumes of common grace that I have partially read through, but there was a lot to work through. This one's just come out. And he has these wonderful lines about how the earth would simply go into obliteration had it not been for common grace. The devastation of human sin is such that without God's active preserving grace, there would be no creation. And so that's the second part that the Kalamazoo definition gives you. And the third is the positive acts of civic righteousness that we see in people. And that's the one that I think is particularly compelling to me. As Jordan mentioned, I work on Bavinck's Ethics, where he talks about virtue quite a lot, perhaps a surprising amount for a Reformed neo-Calvinist guy. And when he thinks about these things, when he talks about common grace, and Kuiper does the same, he talks about these things as these inner virtues of people: civic righteousness, the love between a mother and a child, the kind of civic responsibility and duty and sense of natural love, and all of these things. So in some way, a very inner working of God and God's grace in the life of all people, though non-salvifically. And I think that is really exciting. And I think the second question was why? So if that's my definition, a post-lapsarian grace differentiated from saving grace that can be largely bracketed out into these three terms, though I would want to expand the third definition of Kalamazoo to include more on that inner life. Why is it important? I think it's important because it addresses a very practical question. Why is there so much good in the world, and why does the church sometimes look really bad? And that, I think, should be a question that Christians ask. How can we, if we as Reformed Christians really say, sin has had totalizing effects on the world, sin has touched every aspect of the cosmos, there's not anything that's untouched by human sin and depravity, but yet there's so much good and beauty and wonder in creation and in people. I think of, even just everyday examples. My next door neighbor, his name's Jim, he's wonderful. He is not a believer, but he wakes up at 6 a.m. when it snows and he shovels my driveway. I think that's a good thing. I think that's a thing that is not just good because my husband doesn't have to shovel it, but it's also a good thing because it shows neighborly love, it shows care, it shows concern for the people that are walking on our sidewalk, it shows care not just for me and my household, but also the children walking around getting to school. There's care that goes into those things, and those are good things. And somehow, I think we want to say that is actually good. But we also want to say that goodness comes from God, and common grace gives us language. And I have a list of many more reasons that I think common grace is important that we can return to, but I'll perhaps pass the mic along.
Thank you.
I don't know how different this is going to sound as a definition.
It's common. It's all right.
Well, there we go. but a way that one can put it is to say that is a way of talking about God's unnecessary or unmerited generosity to the entire created order post-fall, and that unmerited generosity, let me say I wrote about it, I should say this, that is energized, or the agency of it is through the third person, but it's a Trinitarian act. And this agency makes possible life actually going on. It also makes possible, and this is analogous to what Jess was saying, it also makes possible an understanding of how you can get things that are wonderful, beautiful, things that may even give you a transcendent experience, but they come from people who are really not good people. All right, so I love Miles Davis. I'll go to the Mad about Kinda Blue being the greatest jazz album of all time. Coltrane was great. We can talk about all that too. But I'm going to go with Kinda Blue for the record. Miles Davis was a misogynist, and he didn't treat all his fans that great either, right? But there's incredible things that came out of him. There's a reason why he's a singular figure. Picasso was a singular figure, also a misogynist, right? So you got these people who've done not very nice things, weren't particularly great people in terms of their character, but yet there are things that they did that when we encounter them, we're lying if we say, well, I can't call that good, beautiful. I can't say that when I encountered that, something did not happen to me that moved me when I encountered that. And we can just go down the line with all kinds of things. It could even be the reason why one would say, and this goes to Kuiper talking about common grace can be directed for good or for ill. I mean, have you ever wondered how in the world does someone like an Adolf Hitler, who in 1921, who thinks that this guy's going to be running Germany 12 years later? What does someone like that, an evil person, have within them that somehow makes them this great movement leader, right? It's something. There's a thing there that is misdirected, we would say. But what is that thing? What is that gifting, that talent, that ability that a person has that can be directed for good or ill, but they have it? And they didn't have it, I would argue, by going out into the woods and making a pentagram and setting it on fire, right? Because they made a deal with the devil, right? There's something that they have, a talent we might call it, that they have, and they are misdirecting it. But is the talent the problem, or is it the direction of the talent that's the problem? How do we account for that? So common grace, I think, helps us to account for that without just saying, well, they were evil. It's like, okay, well, what did they use? That if it had been used for good reasons, we would have said, oh, wow, what a great figure. So in terms of why I think it's helpful, to me, the reason it's most helpful, I think, is that quote from Zaudema about common grace is the presupposition of the possibility of Christian cultural activity. And for me, that's important because, this ebbs back and forth. We were talking about that at the end of Kristen's session. In some Christian circles, people really don't know that there is the possibility of Christian cultural activity. And they don't know that it's possible. They don't know that it is worthwhile. And common grace helps us to account for why it is both possible and why we ought to continue participating in it without, I would say, having a triumphalistic mindset. So for me, that's the biggest thing that I think. I mean, there are other things, obviously, but to me, that's the biggest thing about the benefit of common grace. Oh, you got that one.
It's working well. I'll try
Okay, let's go with that. All right.
Yeah. Can we applaud Jordan, though, for his mastery of alliteration? You noted the theme, Kuiper, community, and common grace. Christ in Community, 2019 Kuiper Conference at Calvin College. Really. To which I can only respond, come on. I mean, really. Well, common grace may be understood and rooted in God's providential care of creation. Can we assume that much, if not more? An ongoing sustaining of all of creation, ongoing as opposed to intermittent or interventionary critical moments, but rather ongoing, even as we're unaware of it, to the present moment. Simply put, common grace has both, as my colleagues indicated, positive and negative repercussions. It serves to preserve, as was stated, and it also promotes, as was already stated. Negatively, common grace can be said to protect, restrain, and curb the effects of sin, as both equally stated, touching everything in creation. Positively, it can be said that it maintains, that God maintains, sustains, promotes, and extends all of creation. So there's a sense in which, yes, it derives from the fall, but I would argue, providence, but I would argue, and this might make for a lively go-round in the question and answer, I would argue that it's also rooted in creation. Human depravity notwithstanding, common grace accounts for human flourishing and cultural advancement. Seems to me common in the common grace designates at least two things. First, it stands, as was already pointed out, in relationship in complementarity, but also in contrast to special grace. But secondly, it also suggests that it's accessible to all, everywhere, at all times. Isn't that interesting? However, this universality of scope, if we may call it that, does not necessarily require an equality of its, or maybe a better word would be uniformity of its manifestation. That is to say, its effects vary in degrees, don't they? Depending on people, settings, what have you. Common grace is grounded, I'm going to argue, in the doctrines of creation, providence, and redemption, if we can extend the wings there from providence, and therefore it's central. It is central to historic Christian theology. We could see it, for example, all throughout the Old Testament in the historical elements of God's calling a people, preserving a people, maintaining a people, maintaining covenant promises, whether you think of Joseph being blessed in Potiphar's house, or Joseph being risen up to govern all of Egypt, or Daniel serving how many kings and kingdoms? To remind us that God rules sovereignly in the affairs of nations. Yes, or Esther's role, for example. And it's, in a sense, encapsulated in a wisdom saying, perhaps you recall it, I think it's in Proverbs somewhere, that the heart of the king is in the hand of the Lord. He turns it wherever he pleases. But we also see it in the New Testament, for example, in Jesus' statements, for example, that it rains on what? The just and the unjust. That the wicked and the righteous experience his goodness. The sun shines on both the just and the unjust. I'm thinking here, too, of Paul's statements. You wouldn't necessarily connect this with common grace, but how about his, let's call it philosophy of ministry, or his philosophy of Christian life? He is free, he says, to be, and to do all things among all people. What is he really saying there? Jew, Gentile. It seems that he's saying, and I'm taking great liberty here, that he has unlimited freedom and unlimited creativity to use what has been placed at our disposal through creation for the purposes of God. So much so that he could even have, in the new covenant, his disciple circumcised in order to open doors among Jewish people. Now, explain that. So free, and I'm not arguing for license, I'm simply saying our creativity and the limits of creation are in fact the ceiling. I'm also thinking of his argument recorded in early Romans about the law written on the heart, right? Gentiles know. Now, he's not arguing they know all. He's not arguing that the Jew knows all. But he is arguing that all people have a minimum moral knowledge. They have a creation and conscience, right? So that all, in the end, are without excuse. Brothers and sisters, that's the language of natural law. That's natural law ethics. Doesn't argue that all people know all things morally, but that all people have a basic moral understanding. And then I'm thinking too, of course, of Paul's statements that the Spirit restrains during the present order, right? Restrains lawlessness. That's maintaining, protecting, guarding. And then I'm also thinking of Peter's statements in, I think, both of his epistles concerning divine forbearance and patience, whatever that means. What are practical examples of common grace? Two come to mind for me. One is wisdom, and the other is moral law. Wisdom. Isn't it interesting that not only Israel, the covenant people, but many of the ancient Near Eastern cultures had their so-called wisdom corpus or wisdom literature? Well, not just Israel. To which we canonically include what? Job, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and certain Psalms. Very interesting. How about the moral law? I just alluded to the natural law. Kuiper speaks very much of God's ordinances, doesn't he, or divine ordinances. He doesn't use the language of, say, the law of nature or natural law, and my hunch is that he probably restricts himself there grammatically because of what's going on in his day, late 19th, early 20th century. If you speak of the law of nature, you're probably triggering Darwinian, social Darwinian sorts of ideas, which he would disavow. The law written in the heart, expressed through the Ten Commandments. Oh, by the way, let me just say this, and this was not part of your question, Jordan, but I'm going to answer what you didn't ask anyway. I find it tragic that Reformed Christians have such a hard time that they're so suspicious of natural law, as if it's a Catholic thing, as if it's outdated or outmoded. Let's let aside the culture for a moment. I'm speaking in-house. We, of all people, should be championing it. I find very often, not just Catholics, but Reformed folks are very surprised when they find out that all of the magisterial reformers affirmed the natural law. Now, did they write a lot about it? Did they argue? Did they put it in the forefront? No, because for them, matters ecclesiological and theological were much more important. That they were one with their Catholic counterparts on the matter of the natural law. And yet today I find deep-rooted suspicion, not so much in my students because they have less baggage, but among many in Reformed community, Reformed theological circles, a resistance toward natural law. Why is common grace important? And herewith, simply stated at the theological level, it's important because it expresses the effect, the outworking, the result of the doctrines of creation and providence, and I would include even restoration or redemption. And one quite basic implication of this doctrinal rootedness is the fact that, and it was alluded to by both Jessica and Vince, sin does not eradicate the goodness of creation. And you did not hear me say it doesn't affect it, just as the imago Dei is not eliminated. For that reason, that natural law is so important. For that reason, we build bridges based on our common morality. In summary, the practical benefits of common grace might include some of the following. It prevents an unfruitful and ineffectual witness and social presence. I think I heard that in both of my colleagues' comments. It also provides the necessary counterbalance, hear me, to an overly personal approach to faith. My personal relationship with Jesus, my personal walk with Christ. I'm not negating the importance of that. I'm simply saying much teaching, standard teaching and preaching, and I'm speaking of orthodox, evangelically minded pulpits. Much teaching and preaching today that's considered orthodox has to do with what God is doing in me rather than what God is doing through me. Now, I acknowledge the first has to be there. But maybe I'm wondering if the focus shouldn't be the latter. What does God wish to do through the church, through us? Further, it prevents the two extremes that are always indicting, and inflicting the church. Isolation on the one hand, capitulation to the culture on the other. Kuiper, I think, wrestled with that and found a middle way in spite of the fact that he was a man of his times. It infuses further our lives and our work with meaning and purpose because it's guided by providence. How about this one? It therefore helps us rediscover the central Christian doctrine of vocatio, vocation, since vocation personalizes divine meaning and purpose in terms of our callings and our stations in life in various seasons, giving us direction in our individual callings. And finally, it aids us both in working toward the common good in the culture, regardless of the cultural context, but it also helps us in finding common ground, that is to say, in bridge building. For me, a very helpful illustration of that is found in Acts 17, where Paul, in Athens, in pre-Christian pagan cultural context, there I am alliterating again, right? is not citing Hebrew scriptures. Rather, he's done his homework and he's using cultural artifacts. He's citing a tomb to unknown God. There were many. He cites 2 poet philosophers that were meaningful to Athenian citizens. Wow, that's pretty creative. That's pretty effective. Now, I'm not speaking to whether he was received well or not, but I think he was effective. That was faithful, call it apologetics, call it bridge building. I think he engages there in natural law, moral reasoning in order to open the door. Now, he doesn't stay there, because general revelation always leads to special revelation, but it's important. And Orthodox and evangelical people have had a tendency to downplay general revelation, and I think for that reason downplay the importance of common grace, because we focus so much on special revelation. I say let's build bridges in order to get to first base. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much. I have a list of questions that I have, but I'm going to go a little bit off script and pick up on something Daryl said. And this isn't just a plug for Daryl and my new introduction that's in Volume 2. But I guess I'm going to start with Daryl, and then I know Vincent has written about this too, and Jess, I'd be interested to hear what you have to say. Can you clarify the relationship between natural law and common grace? Are they the same thing? If not, how do they relate to one another?
Well, I would just initially say natural law is an expression of common grace, just like the 10 Commandments are an expression of natural law. Yeah. Common grace, may we say, is comprehensive in terms of all of creation. And natural law, of course, concerns our awareness of moral reality, that which has been planted into the very fabric of creation as we understand it. So Paul's expression, the law written on the heart, or what C.S. Lewis calls the law of nature, and unfortunately the Tao, that is, that which is irreducible, is important. It expresses moral reality. So the law written on the heart does not constitute the totality of all creation and all of grace, but it's an expression, an important expression of intuiting moral reality.
Okay, let me modify that question a little bit then for Vince and Jessica. Assuming that framework, is it appropriate then to say that an affirmation of common grace entails affirmation of natural law, at least of a certain kind, whether it's a specifically Protestant or Reformed or Kuiperian understanding of natural
law? Based on the development of the tradition in Neo-Calvinism, it's kind of hard to answer yes to that, because you have to reckon with the noetic effects of sin question and the way that plays out, at least for some Neo-Calvinists. It's like, how much of a noetic effect of sin? Well, so much that it's pretty dark over there being outside, people outside the covenant. Which then creates, I think, the question about, well, what does common grace make possible in terms of all these things that God is giving to humans just as humans? And is there any space for overlap for common rationality. And I think that's where people don't have an agreement. And the thing with Kuiper, I think that's tricky about that is you have to reckon with Kuiper that he writes for the occasion. And because he writes for the occasion, it depends upon what point he's trying to make. And sometimes the point he wants to try to make is, yes, we can work with people. Other times, if he's in antithesis mode, he's like, they have a different mind than we have. So when he's in antithesis mode, then it's complete incommensurability. When he's not in antithesis mode, I think that's part of what creates the space for saying, even if he is not quite mute about natural law, he's giving at least some space for people to make an account of natural law. The tricky thing with Kuiper, just like if you're going to talk about the relationship of common grace and special grace, is, well, it depends upon how you're going to look at all the things he wrote, make those things talk to each other, and then, you got to make a call one way or the other. And people make the call one way or the other. So some people are you might call them common grace, natural law Kuiperians, and then common grace and I don't think so natural law common Kuiperians.
Yeah, like Vince has said, I mean, this is certainly a thorny issue within kind of modern neo-Calvinist applications of the theme or pushbacks on that theme. And I think you're absolutely right that Kuiper's way of writing about these things does tend to add both helpful ambiguity on the one hand and seeds of dissonance on the other. I do, perhaps my little biography might suggest it. I think Bavinck is especially helpful here because where Kuiper writes in a more ad hoc fashion, Bavinck writes in a bit more systematic fashion. And I think that helps us at least think through one neo-Calvinist application of this question. Bavinck, of course, does not write this many pages on common grace. I imagine this is probably 1,000 pages. But he does write quite a few. He has a lecture on common grace that he's given in Kampen. He has various things on Calvin and the relationship between common grace. And I think those things are also instructive for us. One of the things that he says in his lecture on common grace is that God did not leave sin alone to do its destructive work. He had, and after the fall, continued to have a purpose for his creation. He interposed common grace between sin and creation, a grace that, while it does not inwardly renew, nevertheless restrains and compels. All that is good and true has its origin in this grace, including the good we see in fallen man. The light still does shine in the darkness. The Spirit of God makes its home and works in all of creation. And of course, I mean, Bavinck is also understood in a number of ways on the question of common grace and how we might apply that and the extent to which we embrace it. But I think if you see some of these things, especially language like the light still does shine in the darkness, all that is good has its origin in God, Bavinck makes that quite clear, and he repeats that time and time again. The light shines in the darkness. In various essays, he really clings to James' words, calling God the Father of lights. That's something he refers to time and time again in essays on the Imitation and on common grace and all of these things. It shows up in his dogmatics as well. And if we take that seriously, I think that we have some version of something that we might be able to call natural law. I appreciate your kind of capacious definition of some version of it, whether it's Catholic or Protestant or something. And I think there are some versions that it would not include and some that it would. But I do think you can see evidences for how common grace would lead you to some, perhaps very muted, affirming more of the noetic effects of sin, some saying, yes, absolutely, there are things that we can know. But what Bavinck clearly says is God's fingerprints are still in creation. God's still not only upholding and preserving creation, but making himself known in some way as the Father of lights. And clearly some of that is also making himself known morally. And I think we can see even in more modern examples of ethicists talking about these things. I think Lou Smedes is a great example of someone that takes these neo-Calvinist thinkers very seriously. But then in a book like Mere Morality, he makes it very clear that something like the Ten Commandments, at least the second table, is known to people. That most people intuitively know murdering is bad, stealing is bad, and all of these kinds of things. And Smedes bases his argument on that type of thing, that the Ten Commandments tell us what we already know, because this is what God has written in creation. And then, despite human sin, through common grace, God upholds some of that knowledge, however muted it may be. And in some parts of the neo-Calvinist world, that's very muted. In some, perhaps it's much less muted. But I do think there's an important connection. But like Vince says, I think the way that connection is seen would be seen very differently in various neo-Calvinist circles.
Let me follow up with you real quick, Jess, too. So Bavinck didn't write as much about common grace as Kuiper, and so I'm not asking whether, Bavinck would have agreed to every jot and tittle of what Abraham the Great wrote about common grace and all that. There's a lot of speculations, and, Kuiper's using his imagination and genius. It's on full display in this work. But what I mean to say is there any kind of fundamental space between Kuiper and Bavinck on common grace, or do you see that they're basically in agreement? And maybe the difference is emphasis, or Kuiper already wrote it, so Bavinck didn't need to spend as much time going over the same territory. Do they present a basically united front on this doctrine? And related to that, I'd love to know the extent to which common grace and or natural law figure in the work that you've done on Bavinck's ethics. What do you see there?
So first, I will admit a bit of lack of knowledge of Kuiper well enough to perhaps answer that question adequately. I've paged through these documents, but perhaps not read them close enough to know exactly where the similarities and differences might lay. As I read in the introduction, though, and I'd be curious to hear some of you reflect on that and then perhaps respond. But it sounds like the relationship, there's an interesting relationship in Kuiper between common grace and election. And I know, Daryl, you probably can speak to that, or Jordan, the way that Kuiper plays that out. And as I was at least reading the introduction and reading some of the language of Kuiper throughout this volume, it seems to me that there might be some dissonances in those connections. Bavinck talks quite a lot about common grace and creation, not rooting common grace in creation, which is another great discussion we can have, but noting that God's creational purposes are upheld. One of the things, I have notes somewhere, that he has this great line, and again, this is his address on common grace at the university, and he says, "Home, society, and state may be reborn by the Spirit of Christ, but they live and exist by virtue of God's ordering of nature." And that struck me as something that might be a bit different than how Kuiper might ground some of these things, but of course Kuiper also grounds things quite strongly in nature, so there might not be a whole lot of difference. So I'm not totally qualified to speak on that, but I can speak on the next question, the relationship between common grace and the Bavinck's ethics. And in Bavinck's ethics, you see Bavinck on display, and he's remarkably consistent, I think, in his emphases. Dirk Kuhlen, who is at the Theological University in Kampen, and the one who found this manuscript and is working on the Dutch annotated version, which will come out in September. There's a great conference. There's flyers somewhere. You should find them and attend. But what he has done, as he's reflected on that, on the ethics, he's shown that these same ideas that we see in Bavinck's dogmatics, things like the gospel as leavening power in the world, and the importance of grace restoring nature, which is something that's key, of course, in common grace, that these themes are the same themes that come up in ethics time and time again. And you can, I think, you can see the resonances of these two themes, grace restoring nature, the gospel having leavening power in the world. You see them in dogmatics, you see them in ethics, and you see them very clearly in his discussions of common grace. Because for him, one of the important things that common grace shows us is the nature of sin, right? Common grace that mitigates against sin to uphold what has already been, what God has created, what God is preserving, shows us the alien nature of sin in the cosmos. And it's because of that alien nature we see that that is what it is in common grace. We also see that that is what it is in the fact that grace restores nature. Grace doesn't, like Bob Inc. often points out, grace doesn't elevate nature. It's not the donum superaddendum, the added gift. Grace restores. And so there's this different relationship between nature and grace that is so fundamental in dogmatics, is also so fundamental in ethics, and then is right at home and the driving principle, I think, in his understanding of common grace. So I think they all work together, and it necessarily so.
Great. Thank you. That should be a plug for you guys all to pre-order the Volume 1 of Bob Inc.'s Ethics. Jess already mentioned this, and I'm just going to read a little bit as a prelude to my next question, and we'll start with Vince for the next question, but I'll invite everybody to weigh in on it. I went, I think it was this morning, and I printed off the 1924 Christian Reformed Church position statement on common grace, and these are the last couple sentences from the website. These points, therefore, still stand as the position of the CRC as of this morning. Maybe Synod hasn't happened yet, so I don't think they can change it until this summer. Synod 1924 also warned against an overemphasis on the doctrine of common grace, deciding that there was more danger of conformity to the world than of flight from the world. So my next question has to do with part of it's the controversy over common grace over the last century. That kind of warning, I guess, it seems to me, a motive of many of the critiques. What are some of those critiques? And another aspect of this is, what are some of the more troubling or common misunderstandings of common grace that you've either encountered in practice or you've read in different theologies, or how can we overload common grace? Can we overload on it, overdose on common grace?
The overdose thing's kind of got me, I was still stuck there for a second. But I think it's true. I've had a number of people, when they talk about Kuiper and talk about the Netherlands, and as I was doing some reading, thinking about the panel, I decided to read what the Protestant Reformed had to say about common grace. You can probably all fill in the blank on that one. But part of what they said was, and what others have said, it's like common grace is like the open door to accommodation. So if you one way it was put was, it creates a bridge that's a two-way street. So not just for the Christian into the world, but for the world into the church. And so I think but to me, that's a potential misunderstanding of it in this sense. What I always want my students to know about with any doctrine is, is something that goes wrong necessary to the doctrine, or is it a misappropriation of the doctrine? And can you tell the difference? And so if you're going to critique it, are you critiquing the doctrine, or are you critiquing people behaving badly with the doctrine? Or badly or apathetically or whatever. I think that's an important thing that has to happen with that piece. Another concern that at least one person I heard address, and it's an important one because of another thing that Kuiper gets associated with, is whether or not Kuiper's language of common grace. If you look at the Stone Lectures, he defines common grace, and then he goes on to talk about human development. And of course, when he talks about human development, you might be aware that people of my pigmentation don't fare so well in that account of development. So I gave Kuiper a pass at that point. It was the line about one rather being an Aryan than Hottentot or Kaffir, in chapter 6, that wound up being a bit of a problem. Or a big problem. And the question, though, is, if you're talking about common grace makes possible development in the world, and then your account of development suggests that basically Europeans are really good at development, everybody else isn't, does that mean that common grace entails a anthropology of human beings where you're going to wind up with this hierarchy, and where people who are like me would never be expected to wind up at this table. All right? And so that's inherent to an account of common grace. My argument is no. But I think if someone reads that, I think you do have to ask that question and ask, well, again, is the problem the doctrine of common grace, or is the problem basically that Kuiper was like most 19th century Europeans who just kind of thought racial hierarchy was just kind of the way of the world? So is that the importing of that cultural assumption into the doctrine, or is it inherent to the doctrine itself? I think that's the question that you have to ask with that. And of course, I think analogous to the first concern that I mentioned, there is the question of, does common grace lead people to diminish attention to the church? Because if your discipleship is out there, does it then mean, it's like I heard Brian Fickert once say that when he was at Dort, if a student said that they wanted to go into ministry, people would look at them strangely and say, why do you want to be a minister when you can be a farmer to the glory of God? And the point being, really? Ministry? Right? So you get the opposite pendulum of people who would say, if you really want to be spiritual, I mean, you're not really going to go to Wall Street, are you? Right? I mean, you ought to do something that's ministry work, which of course means professional ministry, right? Or something associated with it. So you get its mirror image, right? And again, like a broken record, some people do still spin vinyl, so I can say broken record for the camera.
It's coming back, yeah.
It is coming back, especially for audiophiles, you're right. But is that, again, a problem inherent to common grace, or is that another problem inherent to the formation when people are learning about common grace? To me, again, that's the question you've got to be asking all the time with this doctrine or any other. Because a lot of times people blame doctrines for things. And what I want to say is, are you sure the doctrine is to blame, or the people who are conveying the doctrine? Mm-hmm. Because I think that's an important distinction.
Sure. I'll take the moderator's prerogative and just follow up on that for a moment. My colleague and co-general editor of the series, Mel Flickerman, has told the story that he was confirmed to the ministry by growing up on a dairy farm and having to wake up and milk cows at 4 o'clock in the morning. So it can work the other way, too. Why would you want to be a farmer when you can be a minister? Other panelists want to talk about the possible dangers, or...
Well, let's talk about work and vocation. Yeah, that's a problem. I think Protestants, as much as Catholics, tend to create a two-tiered view of work, vocation, and calling. As a matter of fact, it's been running for the better part of 2,000 years. The sacred, the secular, the higher. Luther and Calvin's violent reaction was against an over-monasticism of life, right? No, it was not universal, but it was rampant. So let's sacralize, let's make purposeful farming, being a cobbler, being a ruler, a prince, raising a family, even being a henchman in their day. Yeah, it's just as high a calling. So whatever this idea of full-time Christian ministry is, what is that, by the way? I don't think it exists, quite frankly. And I'm not denying that people aren't called to be pastors. Okay. But the point is, 99.9% of our congregants are called to the marketplace to be butchers and bakers and candlestick makers and nurses and doctors and drivers of hearses and technologists and psychologists and anthropologists. Okay. Very few of us are called to pastor in a vocational sense. So let's feed them. Let's equip them. There's a lack of that, it seems to me, coming from Christian leadership, coming from the pulpit. And I would view the sacred secular as something that visits every generation, and it's both Catholic and Protestant in its variation. And so we constantly need to work against that. So back to the original question, yeah, I think common grace helps us avoid that sort of improper dualism. Why? Because it acknowledges that all of creation is the limit. It's all good. It doesn't deny the effects of sin. So no, I would disagree with the view, you suggested it, not your view, but a bridge allows two ways. It allows wickedness to come into the righteous and righteous to go to the wicked. Allows the world to come into the church or the church to go to the world. Well, that's true of what are the alternatives? Isolation, separatism, or capitulation? Well, neither is inevitable. It seems to me common grace facilitates that healthy medium, right? We go, but we go vigilantly. We're diligent, we're discerning, but we go and claim it all in faithfulness, it seems to me. My concern is in broader Christian circles, small o Orthodox, not necessarily narrow or Reformed circles. And so my concern is it's the doctrine's utter neglect, Jordan. Yeah, we talk a lot about in Reformed circles, but in broader Christian circles, you don't hear much about common grace. I'm sorry. That's tragic itself. Wow. And that's central. That's central to Christian theology, not just vocation. And then finally, I think its lack then, it prevents us from seeing a point intimated and suggested earlier, the goodness of creation. Look, if creation is not good, then why are you spending time as a butcher or baker or a candlestick maker? Let's just go home. Let's just commit suicide, go home into the presence of the Lord where there's full fellowship with Jesus unimpeded, put crassly. But we're left here for a reason. It's because of everything out there that is in the created order. To claim it, to restore it for King Jesus. So we use our gifts, our callings, our avenues of service to do that faithful reclaiming. And if creation is not still good, then it's ruined and all of our efforts are meaningless. But if it's good, that means that our work, our efforts, everything we invest in this life using our gifts and our callings have eternal value. That means the earth, there will be some continuity in eschaton. Will it be transformed? Yes. But there will still be continuity between this life and the next. That means that suggests a doctrine of rewards. That means that there's something in this life, in the physical and the material creation, that's worth preserving and restoring. So there will be some continuity between the present and the eschatological. And if there's not, then there's no such thing as stewardship. To one who was given 10, to another given 5, to another 2, another 1. We use it faithfully because it has present value, not because our efforts are salvific, but because we're stewards. And there will be some continuity, some recognition of that in the eschaton. I don't know about you, but that I find exhilarating. That's why the doctrine of vocation is so important and needs to be rediscovered in every generation.
I think at its best, common grace really allows us to have a kind of doxological character as we go throughout the world. We can go into, to use Kuiper's language, every square inch and recognize these beautiful things that God is doing. We can say all of these good, beautiful, true, wonderful things that we see in this world are from God and for God's glory. And I think that allows for a phenomenal posture in the world. It makes way for many other wonderful postures, like you all have noted, but I think it's really important to hear from the critics of common grace, because that's not how it always goes. There was a spoof before my time at Calvin College, but it was in the student newspaper spoof edition. And around these parts, there's a lot of language of cultural discernment. And students, I think, often learn to discern culture very well. But as the spoof noted, it can go too far. The spoof was a little comic, and it was two young gentlemen. They were college age because they were at Calvin College, and they were looking at a rather risque photo and having this kind of, very pious, thoughtful glance and saying, "We're discerning culture." to kind of nail home the point that, cultural discernment can be a license to go anywhere and everywhere. And it can give us license to perhaps not heed the song, "Oh, be careful, little eyes, what you see," which is the song that I grew up singing. I had a very pious household. And I think we need to take those things seriously, to take the fact that common grace is a really, I think, understood well, a wonderful thing that propels us to see the good things of God in all of creation. But understood poorly, it can compel us to equate those things that are antithetical to the kingdom of God with God's kingdom. And I think we need to hear from people like Hoeksema and Schilder and others those important critiques. We need to hear Hoeksema when he says things like, and I don't think we go as far as him, but I think we need to hear him when he says that common grace gives us a license to have a kind of obliteration of the distinction between the church and society. I don't think that's I don't think properly understood common grace does that, but I think twisted and contorted, and again, if we're going to take seriously the doctrine that precipitates the need for common grace, the depravity of humanity, the fallenness of humanity, the fact that sin infects every corner, then we also should take really seriously that we can sinfully kind of take up these good insights of common grace and have them propel us to places that are not where we should lead. And so I think we do need to take folks like Hoeksema that say we need to be careful of these obliterations and of the distinctions between church and state. He, of course, would say that's what it does. I would want to hear him and say it could. It doesn't have to. But I think we need to take those very seriously. And I was also, as we were preparing, reading, you perhaps might have been referencing Engelsma. I was reading him as well. And he makes this point, and I think it's another interesting one, because I think this one helps us be mindful of how we talk about common grace. Because Engelsma says that the worldview of common grace, and this is a direct quote, the worldview of common grace has proved to be a colossal failure. And when he's saying that, he's saying, you common gracers, you have said common grace gives you this theological justification to go into every square inch, to influence the larger culture, to do all of these things. And then he says, but look at the United States, look at the Netherlands. They don't look more like the kingdom of God than they did before you started talking about and writing all of these beautiful volumes on common grace. They kind of look bad. He uses the language of thoroughly wicked, which is harsh, but that's what he says. And he's saying, if you tell me common grace gives you license to go and reform and restore and all of these things, but I see no evidence of that. And here I think we need to be careful, because one of the things that Kuiper ties common grace to is this kind of progressive development of humanity. And Vince, you were getting into that too, the dangers of how the kind of racialized theology of the 19th century got interwoven with that progressive nature. But I think we also need to be careful about how we talk about this in a kind of transformationally progressive sense of saying things will and must get better. Because again, as we talk about common grace in the back of our head, perhaps in the forefront, should always also be antithesis. And I think Engelsma, his warning reminds us that we ought not to talk about this like common grace just gives us license to have this kind of progressive, as in things being made and developed and richly kind of understood all within the immediacy of history. Because that, again, is a misunderstanding of common grace and what it is and how it propels us into the world. We, of course, can say God gave us this world and continues to uphold this world and continues to give us this task of developing the things that he has made. But to have a kind of triumphalistic posture in that development that necessitates an equation between common grace and bettering of all things, I think, again, is an important warning for us to hold common grace and antithesis together as we do our cultural engagement in many ways.
Okay. Thank you. So before we turn to the Q&A from the audience, I wonder if any of you have questions for each other. I'm going to give you this time to challenge something you've heard before. Or, you can retract things that you've said if you'd like before the Q&A happens with the crowd, but we'll take a couple minutes for intra-panel discussion.
This is for either Daryl or Jessica, and that is on the natural law question. And maybe it's for you first, I think. What I think many Reformed circles, or the way that some people learn Reformed theology, depravity makes alarms go off when people start say anything close to natural law, right? So yeah, I'd just be interested in hearing from both of you about that alarm that goes off, because part of me, I'm wondering. So Bhavink is talking about the lights, so the yeah buts, right, can start to happen. So I was just curious what either of you would say about that.
Curious about either of us, but hands the mic to me. No, I think that's a really important question. The yeah buts are real and true. And I think we, again, not to talk about the fall overly much, but I'm just going to keep talking about it. But I think we always need to remember that for Bhavink, all of this common grace stuff only is discussed in light of the extreme fallenness of humanity. And the same is true for Kuiper, right? All of this language of the obliteration of the created order, were not God upholding and preserving, and all of these things. And so when Bhavink talks about things like God as the Father of lights, I think, again, we're seeing that God is the Father of lights in the midst of a fallen world. And so the world is very dark. and it's God in his light that does shine, perhaps very dimly, but does shine. I think one of the important things that we need to kind of, again, note with this Father of lights language is he's not saying, floodlights are being shown in every corner of creation, but he is saying God hasn't given up. That God still says, this is my creation, and God still says, I'm not done. And there's this wonderful quote, we'll see if I can find it very quickly, that Bhavink, when he's saying all of this, he says about common grace that the significance of the cosmos increases greatly, because while it is true that the world has been corrupted by sin, so here again we hear, if we're talking about common grace and the Father of lights, we're also always talking about a world corrupted by human sin. He says, the world has been corrupted by sin, but it nevertheless remains a work of the Father. Of his own will, he maintains it by his covenant, and by his common grace, he powerfully opposes the destructive might of sin. He fills the hearts of men with nourishment and joy and does not leave himself without a witness among them. And so I think it's that idea of not leaving us without a witness. We see that in the Belgic Confession. We see it in Scripture, not leaving us without some kind of witness. And it's a non-soteriological witness, but it is yet a witness. It's a witness to the way in which God works. It's a witness to the way in which God wants us to live, the moral law. It's a witness to the way in which God wants us to act and love and be. And we might not be able to name that as this is of God. Bhavink is certainly not saying that the non-Christian is going to say on a Tuesday as they're doing something wonderful and good, well, thank the Lord that he has given me this good gift of common grace. But we can. We who God has revealed these things to us through special revelation can say, yes, that is the Father of lights continuing to uphold his creation and giving us good gifts. But I don't actually see any contradiction between Father of lights and the yes buts, because common grace is a response to human sin.
Is there anything about the depravity piece you want to say?
Natural lawyers do not deny the depravity of the human heart or the effects of sin in all of creation, just as Paul would not. Just as the image of God is not eliminated by sin. Is everything affected? Yes. But the image of God is not eliminated. Therefore, the human being can intuit moral reality. Therefore, the law written on the heart must be acknowledged, and we need to utilize that in order to build bridges and get to first base with people in terms of moral things. And if that doesn't exist, then there's no ability to relate to surrounding culture to the unbeliever, to anything outside the body of Christ at all. At all. If there's no common ground. But the image of God has not been eliminated. I'll never forget Robbie George's reaction. Robbie, of course, at Princeton is more Catholic than the Pope himself, and he couldn't believe it, that John Calvin, in spite of the stereotype of human depravity and Reformed thinking, in the Institute, John Calvin says, and yet the sparks, the divine sparks, are still there. They're still there.
Great. I think, again, one of the important things, and I mean, I think I've pretty much said this, but I want to make sure it's overt. I think one of the important things that makes the yes, but and the Father of Lights not in contradiction with each other or conflict with each other is the reality that were it not for common grace, I think Bavinck would say, I certainly would say, we couldn't know anything of God's moral law. It's only because these I think Kuiper would say everything would be obliterated. There'd be nothing to know about. Sin is wide and deep and far, but God has, in his good judgment that says, this is my creation, I'm not going to let it fall by the wayside, I'm not giving up on it. God has continued to uphold it and preserve it and continue to, in all of humanity, show us something of who he is how I see those two as coming together.
Good, thank you. Especially these most recent comments remind me of a couple of things, and you were just alluding to it, that the understanding of common grace really is at first kind of a metaphysical point. Like, why does anything even exist after the fall? Because being is better than non-being, and God is, among other reasons, doesn't want Satan to have achieved his goals of destroying everything. And when Kuiper in Volume 1 is grounding this doctrine biblically, he's looking at the Noahic covenant, which is a very clear kind of existential confrontation with non-being and unreality, and the kind of threat that is. And this is a sort of, this is where you'd be if not for my preserving grace. And when he's looking at it dogmatically and doctrinally in Volume 2, he's rooting his argument in, again, what may be a counterintuitive place given the common perceptions of these documents and figures, but he's going to the canons of Dort and saying there's lights that are still there confessionally among humanity. The image of God is not totally lost. So that's his confessional grounding for his explorations of common grace doctrinally. Let's spend the last 20 or so minutes with some discussion from the audience. I trust there's enough here that we've already discussed to raise some good questions or maybe issues with common grace that you came in loaded with for this fine panel to answer. The mic is there, and I'm not going to go start walking around. So why don't you guys can queue, or maybe you guys can queue up. How about that? That way you have to have some skin in the game. You actually have to stand up and stand in line to get a question.
Hi, thank you for your comments. I'm wondering if you can connect the doctrine of common grace to the vocation of middle management. I appreciate your comments about the butcher, the baker, the candlestick maker, and also the fact that the vast majority of people are not called to employment within churches. Also, a ton of people are not called to employment in what now, those are honestly more artisan careers. And I think when we talk about common grace, we tend to lean more towards affirming the arts. I was preaching on work recently and talked about the continuity of work in the new creation, and had someone come up to me and say, that is not encouraging because I hate my job. And so can you talk about the relationship between common grace and the antithesis as it relates to potentially frustrating vocations like middle management or government contractors?
A couple of things. I think one is the fact that it's true that I think sometimes if someone is saying that common grace is making possible our ongoing stewardship of the created order, and that includes the various dimensions of work, where in some way you're involved in this rulership of the creation. I think what can happen is we can fail to recognize a couple of things. One, you've got to think about then how is that happening in whatever context that you're in. And two, it's important to say that talking about the fact that there's this opportunity for participation doesn't mean that it's a realized eschatological participation. So that, this way that people talk about, oh, I love my job, it's my passion, etc. Ask them if they love everything about their job. There is no job where there is not what you have the mundane, grinded out dimension of it, right? So the semester's coming to an end. That means grading. That means into the semester reports. It's really very exciting. You can see from my facial expression. But the point I'm making is that I think sometimes what happens is when we talk about that possibility, the presumption is that possibility means that you're always going to feel great about it. I think what Common Grace ought to be saying to the person that's in middle management is, it at least ought to tell you that there might be some kind of imaginative agency that you can have where you are. Because it might be difficult where you are. It might be drudgery where you are. The question is, are you willing to use your imagination where you are? Are you willing to think? It's like when someone says, this is the way that business has always been done. That really bothers me, because no, that's not the way it's always been done, because somebody invented that way of doing business, and it became the enculturated way of doing business. So if you don't like that way of doing business, and you have some agency about that, use your imagination. Ask how you might be able to do this differently, how you can make a better culture, et cetera, et cetera. So are there things that person can do to enhance the experience of being in middle management, while recognizing that there might be a lot of things that have a kind of undertow character to them? But is there something I can dare to dream about making middle management something other than, what all the sitcoms are like?
Yeah, and okay. It's better. Okay. Middle management, that might be an unfair stereotype. There are a lot of people that are locked into that due to the structure of our culture. But it seems that one of the effects of a lack of emphasis on vocation is that lay people really are not finding any or almost no satisfaction in their work. Okay, Vince just reminded us that the drudgery is part of every calling, but that's not all there is. Ecclesiastes, of all canonical works, has a remarkable, this is part of wisdom literature, 6, 7, maybe 8 times throughout the screed on what seems to be meaninglessness. The author shifts gears and talks about enjoyment in our work, and things so mundane as working, eating, and being with people. Joy, and these refrains, by the way, are increasing throughout Ecclesiastes. The wisdom of perspective is that we find a measure of satisfaction not just after our work, okay? Not just, ooh, I'm glad that's done and I'm glad I did it. No. There can be satisfaction in our work. At times, not always. We were just reminded. That's not the point. But there can be a measure of and that's why most people in our churches are dissatisfied with their jobs. I don't think I'm exaggerating. That shows something. That shows how important theology is. That shows how important practical ethics is. That shows how important vocation is. Yeah. And especially for people who are working in, say, middle management. I, too, have spent like these two, have spent most of my career in the academy. And just like as in government, there's probably a lot more dead weight, there's a lot more mediocre gifting in administration. And that's unfair, but let me just say it.
Maybe not.
Okay. Yeah. So, praise the Lord for managers, administrators who know how to discover gifts in their employees or in their departments or in their circles and release them. Wow. And I'll bet that middle manager, that administrator can find satisfaction in that. And if the system, if the work can't give that, then maybe he or she is doing something immoral and totally missing the vocation to which God has really called him or her. I really believe that. Now, are there seasons of our lives where we're confused or not having clarity? No, I'm not suggesting that. There's a season for everything under heaven and earth. But I think the norm, the pattern is that we can and should find a measure of satisfaction through our work if we're using our gifts and our callings in obedience to God. And I don't think we need to lay out fleeces or receive blind light revelations to find out what those are.
One thing I'd add real quickly is that I also think for us in general in the modern West, one of the things we need to think about in terms of our participation in the workforce is that we have the luxury of choice with work that is basically not what most people have had in world history. And we presume about work and opportunities for work, things that just were not available for most people and still are not available for many people throughout the world. So I think we need to keep that in mind. It's like, okay, I'm in an environment where I can even think about options. There are a lot of people where this is your options, right? We think this, right? So part of it, I think we have to have that perspective in terms of the way that we think about it. And this still deal with the realities.
I have a question about common grace and special salvific grace. And with common grace, it reminds me that all things matter, all things count. And special salvific grace, some things matter more, right? What can compare with knowing Christ and not going to hell? So my question is, and it's something I've observed, so tell me if my observations are correct or if it's all anecdotal, so maybe I'm off base. But in my looking around, it seems that churches, maybe evangelical, pious churches, that maybe Baptist churches emphasize salvation, redemptive grace, salvific grace. They almost never talk about common grace. And in circles that emphasize common grace, all things count, all things matter, you almost never hear the gospel from them. Is that a fair observation? Is that just my own experience? And if so, how can we do both of these things well?
I think that's part of what happens with various traditions. Sometimes traditions are formed in response to what was missing somewhere else. I do think that there are a lot of churches of the churches, I'll put it this way, that emphasize common grace. I think that's still probably, if you're in Western Michigan, right, you may get an exaggerated sense of how many people are talking about common grace. Northwest Iowa, parts of Canada, other places, but what is this common grace you're talking about, right? But I think in some of those places, it is part of the hazard, right? Especially, infant Baptist situations, people are baptized, confirmed, it's part of the world you inhabit, etc. The gospel may get articulated, but not the way that it's getting articulated at a Baptist church where you're having altar calls and all these kinds of things. But I think every tradition has to be an environment, hopefully, where people are getting formed to think about, yes, this is what we emphasize, but if we're going to do justice to the fullness of what's revealed to us, what else is there that we need to be emphasizing along with what we tend to emphasize? Because it's not like there should be some competition here between common grace and special grace. I mean, it's God's world and God's people that we're talking about here. But in practice, there's reasons for what you observe, I guess is what I would say.
Yes. No, I think that's absolutely right. I think the things that you've observed are perhaps the extreme versions of the way these two can play together. But I do think that there is a reason, and this reaction is part of it. One of the interesting things too that Richard Mouw brings up when he talks about, in particular, common grace in the little book he shines in all that's fair, is the way the infralapsarian and supralapsarian debate might also affect our emphasis on one or the other, or perhaps, hopefully, both. But he makes the point that, and of course the infralapsarian, supralapsarian debate is about the logical ordering of divine decrees. What did God decree to do first? Was it to create the world and then allow the fall, or to elect and then all the rest happened? And And Mao's point is that that too might help shift the emphasis on something. If the point of creation, if the point of all of this is the election of people, then that's going to be the focus. And if the point of this is a world bursting with potential and diversity in which people are also elected, then there's going to be perhaps potentially a wider focus on both election as this good and glorious thing, but also the works of creation as things that bear God's glory. And I think that's a really interesting addendum to the discussion, that may also be something floating in the background.
The question I have will follow up, I think, on this discussion. So we've talked about how common grace is kind of centered in the background. We have concepts of doctrine of creation, protology, God, providence, and then also redemption. I would also argue eschatology, in that much of the literature over Kuiper's understanding or articulation of common grace concerns how he subsumes the economy of common grace within particular grace or lets it stand apart. And I think either of those options provide a stance towards the world. It assumes a specific eschatology, and it gives us a sense of our priorities when we enter into the world, whether it's ecclesial, the center of gravity is with the church, or something else. How would you articulate that? And this gets to the discussion of order of decrees and whatnot, or does creation or common grace stand apart as an economy separate from that? How would you interact with some of that, especially with Zadama coming up in the discussion, our reading of Kuiper? I'm throwing a lot out there.
I'm inclined to say that big picture, all of those things resolve to God's ultimate purposes in reclaiming his world. And with Zadama, I'd say that the long view suggests that Kuiper certainly early on was like this totally other work of common grace, right? But that eventually it starts trending towards serving the ultimate purposes of special grace. To me, when I think about the relationship between them, again, for me, the big question is, how are Christians living a life of utter fullness and faithfulness before the face of God? And how are you doing that? And how is the way that you're understanding what God has done for us and making it possible for us to live that kind of life? How do I give an account for that? And special grace is how I'm talking about how I'm made alive, how I see things, how I even know that there is something called common grace and I can recognize it. Common grace is the language for understanding that this terrain in the created order is terrain where possibility remains. It is not a terrain of utter futility. So if it's really right there in Genesis 3 with the fall. He doesn't say, hey, remember all that stuff about multiplying? Forget it. Right? No more birth. Hey, remember like that working the ground stuff? Nah, just all weeds for you. Sorry. No, it's along with the fruitfulness from the ground. You don't only get fruitfulness from the ground, you've now got complication that goes along with that. So it's never been about an exercise in futility. But until everything is ultimately set right, it's going to be a challenging life to steward well life in God's creation. And the people that ought to be doing that stewarding of life well in multiple dimensions are Christians, because they're the ones that have access to and can understand the directions for doing this. Which doesn't mean that there's an easily Christian way to describe every single thing to do, but that we do, at least at the principial level, have an orientation towards how we ought to be living in God's world as God people. And common and special grace together are helping explain how that's a possibility. Right? And that's the way that I tend to think about it.
Let me just say, in the 91 chapters that Kuiper included in Volume 2. There's just about almost everything that you could ask of Kuiper. At least there's some answer to it. He does spend 7 chapters on insurance. They're really interesting, actually. I mean, it has to do with your views of providence and human agency and all these sorts of things. So it's a really insurance, not assurance. Insurance, yes. I'm sorry, insurance. That's right. But the last chapter is on the influence of common grace on particular grace. So again, commending these massive tomes to your daily study.
That actually segues to my question. There's so much new material here. What in particular, personally, have you discovered that's maybe new or exciting in Kuiper's Common Grace?
Yeah, I had just a lot of fun reading through this second volume. I think it's masterful, and I mean some of the language that Kuiper uses is particularly, I think, both imaginative and really compelling. I mean, language like this kind of obliteration of the world, if not for common grace. He says, and this is in just one of the first few chapters, without common grace, everything would collapse into a single awesome peal of thunder and sink into hell. And I mean, that's not like the most motivating thing, perhaps, but in some ways it also is, right? It reminds us of both who we are and who God is. And I think you see that all over the place. I mean, Kuiper has this is both deeply theological. I mean, this one is all about kind of systematic doctrinal questions, but it's still deeply devotional. I mean, one of the things that I, as I was paging through it even just this past week, was really, what I really took away was how in awe of who God was and how God was working he was. And that made me step away. And again, and I'm sure many of us have these conversations on a very academic level very often, right? I mean, when we're debating common grace, we have, we're thinking of Hoeksma in one ear and Schilder in another ear and Engelsma and, all of these particularities and all of these questions. And that's really important. And Kuiper doesn't shy away from any of that, but he also does it with, I find, just an immense amount of awe in look what God continues to do. And that sense of awe and wonder and praise and glory is one of the things that I wasn't expecting to walk away from in reading through this volume, and I did. And it was I think, very exciting.
One thing I'd add is I think if you have the volumes, and even some other things he's written, most of these things were in the weekly paper that he was being produced. And so if you have them all together, then and you start thinking about who his audience was, right? So remember, his audience, the Kleine Leiden, the little people, right? I mean, not only the little people. I mean, but many of them, the little people, right? But the point is that it helps to put in our frame of mind his larger conversation partners were not just scholars, right? He was trying to speak to a large populace, and it was arguably a form of catechesis, right? So and I think sort of seeing that in succession and thinking about who this is, it helps us to think about Kuiper not only as a figure who, I think, for whatever flaws he had, he was a person of tremendous piety and a tremendous commitment to public engagement, and it wasn't a competition for him between those things. And so here's this person writing for these people, wanting to educate them, not just as some kind of vanity project. He really wanted to serve and help people. Yes, we can call the role and the flaws, but it shows you that there's a reason why this person's worth reading, right? And I think, I guess this is an important thing to say, especially because it's being filmed or videoed, whatever format we're talking about. Just because a figure has flaws is not a reason to dismiss a figure. And we're at a moment in our culture, it's not the only moment in our culture where this has happened, but where people quickly dismiss figures because of some perceived flaw, in which case they should probably dismiss themselves also. But because they're no perfect people. And with Kuiper, I mean, look, I'm an African American sitting up here. I mean, I'm happy to throw Kuiper under the bus about race. And I can throw him under the bus about drinking his own Kool-Aid and all these other kinds of things. But none of these are reasons for me to say, therefore, there's nothing that's in all these pages that cannot be appreciated. Most of it can be appreciated. Some of it you appreciate it because he's writing in his context. It's like, hey, it's not kind of how I would think about it, but it's interesting to see how he thought about it. But a lot of what he wrote, I mean, this is to me why his picture's in my office. It's like, yeah, he's really flawed, but if I do my critical thinking work, my discernment, I see that here is someone gifted by God who helps us articulate why it's proper for Christians, as people that are properly pious, to also be properly engaged in public life. So to me, I mean, he does that in ways that I think are really compelling, and with language that is really fascinating. So, that to me, that it's important to commend Kuiper in that way. Flawed, oh yes, but definitely read it.
Okay, well, yeah, let me just take, again, the moderator's prerogative in having worked on these volumes. He has a real gift for taking something that you thought you knew or might have assented to intellectually and adding a twist to it that makes it really come home. And I'll give you an example, and it builds on what Vince was saying earlier about work and toil. So, you know, if you read through your Bibles, probably you get to the part about the fall and the curse, and it may even say the curse, you know, in the subject header of that part of Genesis is describing what's happening. And it's easy to think that, you know, that's really a bad thing that's going on there, and we're down in the dumps about it and low. And Kuiper acknowledges all that and grapples with it. But he puts a twist on it and says, you know, think of it also as a promise, right? It's a promise you're going to have food. It's going to be a lot of work and it's going to be toilsome, but the promise is right there in the curse. There's a good news there. There's a promise you're going to have children amidst the pain and suffering that goes along with having and raising children. So he has a way, I don't know if that's pastoral or there's a sort of a gift to that to make that really come home. So that's my final word of a plug. One other thing that was occurring to me as we were up here is all the gifts that have been on display, some of them uncommon and yet still common gifts, common grace gifts. The erudition, the grace of those on our panel, the technology that's allowed our voices to be amplified and for the video to be recorded, and especially the work of the AV staff. So join me in thanking all of those who've done the work to put this panel together.